Okay, perfect. So this is a meeting of the City Seal Task Force. The date is September 15th. So I'll just jump right into roll call and introductions. So let me just pull up my list here. So I'll start with Aditi,
Present.
Suzanne,
Present.
Pucci,
Here.
Michael,
I'm here.
VJ,
Here.
Rachel should be getting on soon. Not, she let me know that she's coming. Dakota.
Here. And I'm going to note I'm going to be in transit for the first part of the meeting. So if my camera is off, I'll still be here and listening. I'll just pipe in when you need me.
Sounds good. Thanks for Dakota. And Rachel just logged on.
Oh, joining me.
And Noreen, I'll have you introduce yourself in just a moment, but Noreen.
Present.
Excellent. And Eileen is not able to make it today. She let me know. She's officially back, and she let me know that she's just very busy with elections for tomorrow, so she's not able to join. Okay, so Noreen, just very briefly, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself as the new Salem Arts Commission appointee, and just yeah, just share a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in the task force.
Sure, happy to. Maureen Gashinard, longtime Salem resident, former school committee member, current chair of the Public Art Commission. I come here in wearing that hat. I'm a retired nurse educator. I taught for 25 years at North Shore Community College. I'm very happily retired and engaging in City Seal Task Force and Public Art Commission and League of Women Voters and fun things like that. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled that you were able to join us. Thank you, Noreen. Okay, so moving right along. So the next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. So we just have to review and approve the meeting minutes from August 28th. Did everybody get a chance to look through those? Aditi, go ahead.
Can someone please tell me who seconded that meeting? When we wrapped it up. Sorry, it was a long one and I
Oh, yeah.
don't remember.
I unfortunately can't remember either. Does anybody know? I'd have to look at the recording. Well,
I can
we
go
will
and look.
look.
I can go and look. I was trying to save me time if someone remembered.
Yeah. Just look through the recording and we can fix that. Okay, so if there's no discussion, we can move forward with a motion to approve the meeting minutes with Aditi's pending change around who seconded the motion.
Move to approve.
Can I get a second?
I second it.
Seconded by Rachel. All those in favor, raise hand. Great. Noreen, are you a yes?
I'm abstaining since I wasn't there.
Okay, great. Okay, moving on to the next agenda item. So yeah, without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Michael Feener to present to us on Sumatra and its maritime history on the historical and cultural perspective. So Michael, go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you all very much for giving me the time. It's good to be back after a bit of an extended absence while I was away on field work. So thank you guys for persevering, for giving me the spot. If I could share my screen, I can put up a few slides. Okay. Can you guys see slides now?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, good morning, I guess good evening for everyone. So I had been planning for several months to use the presentation slot here to kind of do a deep dive into the dynamics of relationships between Salem merchants and Sumatran society during the late 18th, early 19th century. And if time allows, I'd still love very much to give that full presentation, although some of that may be covered in the discussion that I see VJ has coming up later this month. But given the sort of tenor of some earlier conversations and some things that were said about Aceh and Sumatra in general, I feel that we really need to pull back a little bit and establish some sort of basic background knowledge about Sumatra, about Aceh in particular, that can help to contextualize their connections with Salem in light of a much longer history of maritime connections, and also to give a better sense of contemporary society in Aceh today, right? In a way that will maybe help to explain some of the feelings that the Salem seal engenders there today. So just to start, and again, very basic here. So Sumatra is an integral part today of the Republic of Indonesia. Indonesia is the fifth largest country on the planet. It covers 3 time zones. It's just about the size of, say, Maine to California if we superimpose it on a map of the United States. Indonesia has over 285 million people. And though population is astoundingly diverse. There are 718 distinct languages spoken in the country, with thousands of dialects added on top of that. As you see on the map here, Indonesia is kind of the pivot point between maritime trade across the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific, and it's been that way for a very long time. Within that vast archipelago of islands, we're talking over 17,000 islands, depending on how you count them. Could be much more when you consider these tiny little dots that are off of some of the larger islands. And the country is currently divided into 38 provinces. And 10 of those provinces alone are on the island of Sumatra here. Sumatra is the largest island to be fully incorporated into Indonesia, right? Indonesia includes large parts of Borneo and large parts of Papua, but they share those with other nations. Sumatra itself is 1,100 miles long and about 200 miles across. It's big. It's got 65 million people, and just on this one island, 52 distinct languages. It's majority Muslim, about 85%, but it's also incredibly religiously diverse. And within Aceh itself, within Sumatra itself, this tiny tip up here, if you can see my cursor, up on the very northwest tip of the country, Aceh, is a province with a special autonomy status within the Republic of Indonesia. And that special autonomy status gives it sort of unique local authority over issues of law, religion, and custom. And Aceh itself is big. It's about 5.5 million people. So we're talking about big places here. The island of Sumatra is a remarkable sphere of biodiversity. We're talking thick jungles, very high mountains, huge mangrove swamps, right, covering dozens of distinct ecosystems. And this biodiversity has made Sumatra a major point of production for export commodities throughout its very long history, including in the modern period, some rather extractive and violent forms of economic exploitation. As you can see on the screen here, going from the top left, from gold mining to rubber plantations, coffee plantations, timber products, and probably the most destructive of all, of oil palm plantations, sour plantations, which have advanced shockingly over the past 20 years in Aceh. Forest land, primary forest land that had been preserved in Aceh all through the long civil war that I'll be talking about at the end of the presentation. During the war, there was very little logging going on because the forests were being used primarily, well, not primarily by, but the forests were being used by the separatist Free Aceh movement as bases for their operations. And the peacetime dividend brought to Aceh incredible economic devastation, with now that the peace was there and the rebels weren't in the forest anymore, major oil palm plantation interests moved in to clear cut just millions, literally, of acres to burn down and plant with oil palm. But Aceh had a very different relationship with its natural environment, with its trading partners going back. So Aceh, not just Aceh, but all of Sumatra is the site of several remarkable locations of the earlier what we call Hua Bin civilization, right? Something that was primarily first identified with pottery remains in coastal Vietnam, but which was a cultural complex that spread all across Southeast Asia from about 8,000 years before the present to about 2,000 years before the present, resulting in sites all around Aceh of massive shell middens and cave burials that sort of moved in and added a new layer onto the already developing megalithic cultures across Sumatra. And we have about a dozen distinct megalithic profiles all across the island. This happens to be in West Sumatra. But these megalithic cultures survived into the 20th century as well, some of them still remaining active ritual sites. This is the island of Samosir inside the volcanic lake of Lake Toba in North Sumatra. Um, and today, religious traditions include, as I mentioned before, not only Islam, that's a mosque on the side with the guy on the motorcycle, but also there's a Christian church up on the left here, a Chinese kelenteng or ancestral ritual hall in Aceh. So we're talking about an island of remarkable internal diversity. In terms of global commerce, we have remarkable finds dating back to the mid-8th century at places like Bongol on the Bay of Sibolga, where we have huge deposits of Abbasid coinage, that is coinage from Iraq in the 8th century, of Persian lusterware, but also of Indic inscriptions in Sanskrit and not yet Old Malay there, so they're all just in Sanskrit. And huge finds of Indian beads and Middle Eastern glassware and bronze work largely produced in India at that time. And so from the 8th century, you get the sense that Sumatran ports are already being plugged into major circuits of global commerce, spanning all the way from the Western Indian Ocean region, from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa, all the way to Sumatra, and then back up to the trade with China and the Western Pacific. But it was really in the 14th century that big things started to happen in Sumatra. And this is primarily because one of those forest products that I mentioned earlier, camphor, right, which is the resin produced in giant camphor trees, was seen by many in both the Christian and the Muslim world in the 14th century as a sort of effective an effective pharmaceutical for combating the spread of the Black Death, which ravaged the Middle East and Southeast Asia in the 14th century. Based on the work of Arabic physicians like Ibn Butlan, you began to have the sense that you began to have a developing sense first in the Islamic world, and then as Arabic was translated into Latin in the Latin West, that this camphor, this particular tree resin, could be very helpful for, say, stuffing your plague mask and helping you deal with the Black Death. And so with that, the exports from Sumatra went through the roof. And we can trace a lot of this history, not just in sources in Chinese and Arabic and Persian, that is written materials, and later in Latin European languages. But moving all across northern Sumatra, we see a real proliferation of inscriptions in Arabic, Persian, and later in Malay that begin to give us the sense of the establishment of major Muslim trading ports all across northern Sumatra, first on the west coast and then up along the top of Banda Aceh and back down the Straits of Malacca. And so it's in the 14th century, for example, that at Pasai, in the province of Aceh today, we find the first local port polity to define itself as an Islamic sultanate, with the ruler there converting to Islam in the late 13th century, and the archaeological remains around Pasai show foundations of substantial brick structures built along the estuary of the river there. The development of very sophisticated traditions of Arabic epigraphy carved in local stone, as well as huge imports of earthenware from India and ceramics, starting with ceramics from China, and then after the Ming ban on exports, that being supplemented with glazed blue and white ware that are being produced in places like Thailand, Vietnam, and what's today Myanmar. These Achinese sultans were very much plugged into the sort of globalization of the time, adapting royal regnal names directly from ruling dynasties in Syria at just about the same time from the Ayyubid dynasty, and beginning to sort of supplement local cultural production with some really high-end engagement with luxury cultures from across the Indian Ocean. And so several members of the royal family of Pasai, for example, were buried in elaborate marble graves that were imported from Gujarat in India and later customized on site for particular rulers. But at the same time that Islam is making these advances along the coasts of the north, it was also in the 14th century that you began to have a new expansion, a sort of secondary expansion of tantric, a sort of mixed Hindu, Buddhist, Indic religious expansion coming from the south, from Java, patronized primarily by this guy, Aditya Varman, a scion of the ruling house of Java at the time, who moved into Sumatra, into Damastraya, and then into the Sumatran highlands in the 14th century, bringing with him a sort of a new agenda of Indicizing, that is sort of spreading this sort of new tantric Indic culture across Sumatra that we see revealed in both Sanskrit and Old Malay inscriptions all the way up the spine, going up into West Sumatra. And we also, from this time, have some of the beginnings of the earliest works on paper anywhere in Sumatra. So this Tanjung Tana manuscript, which also carbon dates to the mid-14th century, you see it's written in an Indic-derived script. It's largely a sort of local interpretation of a classical Sanskrit legal work. But this text itself, the author signs his name as a guy called Hoja Ali, right? So we've got in the 14th century Sanskrit, that is Hindu legal text, being written in Sumatra by guys with identifiably Persian Muslim names. And so this gives, I think, a sense of just how incredibly complex the definitions of things like religion, ethnicity have been in Sumatra now for at least 700 years. And we see this all across, back up in Pasai in that Islamizing sultanate. At about the same time, in the 1380s, we have a pair of head and foot gravestones. The headstone is inscribed all in Arabic script. The footstone is inscribed in Old Malay, in an Indic script. And both of these stones mark the ends of a grave of a princess of the royal house of Pasai, who herself was of mixed Bengali and Turkish extraction, right? And so we're getting a very sort of, I think, complex picture of the ways in which the cosmopolitan of Sumatran society had developed from the 14th century onwards. Okay, so big things happening in the 14th century. And then at the end of the 14th century, in about 1394 to 1397, based on uranium thorium isotope dating that my colleagues and I have done of tsunami deposits in limestone caves on the Sumatra coast, we realized there was a massive tsunami that struck the west coast, wiping out, as you'll see, almost all of the area that today we identify as the Pepper Coast, all right, of Sumatra on the west coast, all the way up to Banda Aceh and the surrounding islands. This major earthquake was absolutely devastating, leaving a huge impact on the archaeological record of northern Sumatra in particular. And the only things to survive that are up perched on a very few highland sites that were just above the wave in the 15th century, including these very elaborate plain graves, which show a lot of stylistic carryover from places in Tamil Nadu in southern India. And it wasn't until about a century after this 15th century flourishing of small coastal civilizations like that at Lamre in Aceh that we begin to see, about a century later, people starting to move down from the highlands once again to the coast, once again to engage in trade, leading to the development of a number of new political formations in the 16th century, most famous of which being the Sultanate of Aceh, which is known for its well, it's known for a lot of stuff, as I'll talk about in a minute, but especially this type of tombstone here with these two little wings on the side of it. They're called Batu Aceh or Aceh stones that were a really distinctive cultural signature of the Sultanate. Now, Aceh rose to prominence in relation to all of the other newcomer sultanates of the 16th century because of the aggressive lead it took in countering Portuguese maritime expansion into Southeast Asia. Right? So in the 16th century, after the Portuguese established themselves at Goa, they set their sights on controlling the sort of pinch points on the spice route going further east. They launch a major set of assaults to take over these sort of fledgling sultanates all across Southeast Asia. Many of them, probably the most notable, Malacca, falling to the Portuguese in 1511. But in response to that, Aceh goes on the offensive against the Portuguese, bringing in military engineers first from Gujarat and then later from the Ottoman Empire to help this new Achenese Sultanate establish state-of-the-art fortifications built largely on models that were then being developed in northern India to develop a defensive mechanism all across the coast and from which to launch naval expeditions that not only pushed back the Portuguese in the 16th century, but as we move into the 17th century, of the Achenese actually starting to extend their own military reach outside of Aceh proper, down both the west and east coasts of Sumatra, and even establishing control over a number of small sultanates in the Malay Peninsula by the early 17th century. This makes Aceh one of the most prosperous and one of the most powerful states in all of Indonesian history. These are some of the ruins of the palace complex of the Sultanate at Banda Aceh. And we know from visitors, both Muslim, Chinese, and European visitors from the 17th century onwards, that Aceh is really seen as an incredibly powerful sultanate with a real taste for very elaborate public displays of both royal power and Islamic identity, as we see in this sort of elephant procession that was led to Friday Mosque for the Sultan in the early 17th century. And this European depiction of the funeral of Sultan Iskandar Thani, or Iskandar II in 1641. With all this power and wealth, the court of Aceh began to patronize the development of new forms of culture, including this royal seal, this ninefold seal, which becomes the preeminent symbol of Achenese sultanic authority, which is itself adapted from Mughal court seals in India from about the same time. And we see this kind of new taste for Achenese adaptations of Indian culture being recognized even in China, whereby the 17th century you begin to have some Chinese potters starting to produce works, especially for the Achenese export market, that take elements of that same ninefold seal, add them with very crude attempts at trying to replicate the Arabic script, and marketing them for prestige consumption in Aceh. We also can follow Aceh's diplomatic history through a series of letters. You can see the seal on the bottom letter here to the Ottoman Sultan, including some very impressive missives addressed to European leaders. This long piece on this kind of wallpapery kind of background being a letter to James I, sent from the Sultanate of Aceh in the 17th century. And the footprint of Aceh's cultural legacy extends all across Southeast Asia as we find examples of these Aceh-style tombstones, these Batu Aceh, spread all across the archipelago, with probably the extending all the way from Ayutthaya in what is today central Thailand, all the way east to Halmahera, right, in the very eastern part of Maluku province in Indonesia. So Aceh is not a sort of a small island population. This is a population that had a major cultural footprint all across 3 time zones of what is today Southeast Asia. Another major factor of Aceh's sort of identity to this day is the importance of Islam and Islamic learning. Aceh had become a center for Islamic cultural production in the 16th century, attracting scholars from the Middle East, from South Asia, to come and work at the court and produce a number of works, both in Arabic and in Jawi, or sort of Middle Malay written with the Arabic script. And the traces of this literary and religious influence also extend across the archipelago. So this is one of the oldest mosques in Indonesia. It's in Ambon in eastern Indonesia, in the province of Maluku. But here the text that these guys have pulled out to look at is actually a text written by a 17th century scholar from Aceh, Abdul Ra'af al-Jawi. It's the first complete commentary on the Quran written in the Malay language, and a copy they have surviving out there in Maluku. And these texts were also sort of formed the basis of not only just things that you sit and read or teach in formal settings, but also the textual production of Aceh was a major influence on sort of performative cultures of recitation, of poetry reading, and of other performances all across Indonesia. The forms of Islam that we find historically sort of central to Aceh's identity are moreover themselves remarkably diverse. All four of these pictures are of different mosques in Aceh, and we begin to get a sense of just, how much sort of local experimentism and dynamism went into the adoption and the adaptation of Islam in Southeast Asia. And Aceh is, again, only one of literally dozens of distinct cultures that flourish across Sumatra during the same period. So these are all taken from the Minangkabau highlands of West Sumatra, where older megalithic traditions were incorporated into sort of local elaborations of aesthetics. But today, I think what is Minangkabau is most known for is its sort of remarkable integration of Islamic law into a matrilineal descent system, right? And so one of the things that Minangkabau is really famous for is the ways in which it has sort of taken a deeply rooted system of gendered power and property rights and used that as the basis for a reinterpretation and a reintegration of Islamic law. So some really interesting stuff in terms of cultural adaptation. New players come into the picture, though, in the 19th century. This is an oil painting that I've actually seen several copies or examples of which in Salem back in the day. These watercolors of Fort Marlborough at Bengkulu, a little bit further down the coast. This was a port that the British tried to establish a fort on, or they did establish a fort on in the 18th century. And when the British came, they not only tried to sort of establish monopolies for the East India Company to trade in things like pepper, but they also ended up, I think, inadvertently adding new dimensions to the cultural matrix of Sumatra. These images here of a festival called Tabut. This is a commemoration, usually a specifically Shiite commemoration of the first 10 days of the Muslim New Year that coincides with the epic battle of the martyrdom of Muhammad's grandson Hussein in Iraq. But all across the Persianate and the Indian world, these had taken on not just mourning, but often very festive tones. And so this 10-day celebration that you find in West Sumatra is something that you don't find in other parts of the island. You only find it in Bengkulu and Priaman, that is the two places where the British established forts in the 18th century. And that's because the British had brought with them first a number of sepoy soldiers, that is, of Indian mercenary soldiers, and then later after that, they transported a great number of convicts from South Asia that were brought to these settlements in Sumatra. And when the British pulled out after the Treaty of London in 1824, they simply left all of these South Asians and their descendants behind in Sumatra, who intermarried with local populations, and again, inspired new kinds of cultural hybridity all along this West Coast. And of course, it's precisely this West Coast that we see as the site of American, and especially Salem pepper trade, right? Starting right at the very end of the 18th century and extending through the first 4 decades of the 19th. And that becomes the origin of the seal, which again, I said, I hope that if we find we need after Vijay's presentation some more in-depth dives into these dynamics of the 18th century or an early 19th century, I'd really like to take those on in a separate talk. But let's look at what happens at the same time the Salemites are in Sumatra. So while the Salem traders are doing business on the Pepper Coast up in what is today Aceh province, just to the south of that in the Minangkabau highlands, another export economy, primarily based on the expansion of coffee planting, begins to introduce a new level of prosperity to that part of Sumatra. The money that comes in with this starts to bring a number of new lifestyles into Sumatra, including things like an expansion of the use of tobacco, the introduction of opium, and other what were deemed by the local religious establishment undesirable social practices. And so in relation to these new cultural change that is spurred by economic growth, a number of West Sumatran religious leaders coming back from the Hajj to Mecca in 1803. During that brief window when Mecca was briefly controlled by the Wahhabis at the turn of the 19th century, they come back with a new reformist impulse to quote unquote purify West Sumatran society of what they see as un-Islamic practices. This leads to something called the Padri Wars, which last for about 2.5 decades in West Sumatra. And which were finally sort of ended with the introduction of a new player again. So in the face of this new religious revolution to redefine West Sumatran society, some traditional leaders decided to ask the Dutch for assistance and intervention into this conflict. The bringing of the Dutch in to oppose this new Islamic force in Sumatran society starts to create a new rift, a new oppositional identity for Islam against Western colonialism. And when the Dutch forces finally, quote unquote, pacified the Padri movements, it kind of opens the door for a massive expansion of Dutch power across many new parts of Sumatra, especially in the north, where in places like Medan, just on the borders of Aceh, the Dutch introduced sort of 19th century style, sort of industrial scale plantations for things like indigo and tobacco, establishing what might be called a really high colonial order, facilitating a sort of a new massive immigration of people to work in these plantations from the island of Java, but also from China and from South India, and establishing a new sort of high colonial form of control in North Sumatra. And to facilitate these new colonial interests, the Dutch needed to assert control over the main waterway that would sort of allow ships coming across the Indian Ocean from Europe to get into the Straits of Malacca and get all these exports out of places like Medan. The Dutch established a major coaling station for steamships at the end of the 19th century on the island of Sabang, which is just off the coast of what is today Banda Aceh. And to try to assert control over Aceh, the last independent sultanate in Sumatra at this time, the Dutch launch an invasion in 1873 that leads to decades of incredibly bloody conflict between the Acehnese and the Dutch. This Aceh War, as the Dutch call it, or the Dutch War, as the Acehnese call it, left an incredibly deep impact on both societies. And today, the Dutch have a kind of obsession about the trauma of the Aceh Wars that is sort of a major source of national shame today. And in Aceh, this sort of notion about being the last to resist Western colonialism is a deeply imprinted part of Acehnese identity. And this resistance was largely elaborated in the form of Sufi Islam, right? Of sort of mystical Islamic practices that, among other things, were meant to sort of increase sort of not only communal solidarity, but in some cases also sort of purported sort of spiritual protection against the Dutch on the battlefield, which unfortunately we know was not always successful. And this is a handwritten Quran from the Danish Royal Library in Copenhagen, with a note on the inside leaf that it was taken by a Danish physician who accompanied the Dutch expedition in Aceh to the Gayo Highlands in the 1890s. And this book was taken, they said, off the body of a fallen Acehnese. And you see what we have here in the corner is actually a bullet hole that is pierced through the entire book. as the Quran was seen as literally protecting them from this intrusion of these Western infidels, and running onto the battlefield with a book as a shield, unfortunately did not work in that case. But we do have the long shadow of this sort of a history of violent resistance to outside colonial control, leaving a very deep impact on Aceh. So the Acehnese not only were able to resist the Dutch, who didn't formally, from 1873 all the way to 1908, when the Dutch formally said they controlled Aceh, but sporadic sort of guerrilla resistance continued all the way through up until the Second World War, when the Acehnese first collaborated and then later resisted the Japanese occupation of the island. And then finally, after independence, the Acehnese, or after integration into independent Indonesia, the Acehnese tried to maintain a sense of their own distinctiveness from the larger archipelago. This took a new flavor in 1971 after the discovery of massive natural gas reserves in northern Aceh. And after several years of exploitation of this natural gas wealth by the Indonesian central government, without an equitable sharing of this with Acehnese society itself, a new political movement, the Free Aceh Movement, or Gerakan Aceh Merdeka, or GAM, arose in Aceh and started a campaign of armed resistance against the Indonesian state from 1973 all the way up until 2005. The end of the conflict wasn't necessarily a kind of a natural end to armed standoff between the Free Aceh movement and the Indonesian national government. This peace was really facilitated by the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004, where at the very end of 2004, another massive tsunami scraped the western coast of Aceh. You see, really devastating, wiping away almost everything in its path, resulting in huge amounts of loss of life and a complete destruction of physical infrastructure and economic capacity in the country. The devastation was unbelievable. And in those first years after the tsunami, from this quick building of mass graves to the establishment of temporary barrack accommodations to dealing with how do you deal with, for example, massive steel ships that are carried almost a mile inland and dropped on top of a village, due to a huge amount of international aid, especially from places that historically recognized a connection with Aceh. And I'm thinking here not only of Salem, which there were some really sort of inspiring moves from Salem to send aid to Aceh after the tsunami, but also from places, for example, like Turkey, which recognized a long-standing connection with Aceh. These places joined the international appeal for rebuilding Aceh. And part of that rebuilding entailed a final resolution to the long-standing conflict between the Free Aceh movement and the Indonesian government, which just celebrated its 20 years of sustainable peace, which is a really remarkable achievement given just how devastating that period of conflict was. I mean, this is a period of that has been widely cited by international organizations as a period of immense human rights abuses, gendered violence, mass disappearings, a really traumatic time for Aceh, and the ability for Aceh to pull together after the tsunami and realize that there were bigger things they had to worry about in terms of the reconstruction of Aceh and the establishment of this peace accord that's now held for 2 decades has brought a kind of a new life to Aceh, which has undergone remarkable development, not just in terms of physical infrastructure, but in terms of social development over the 20 years since the tsunami. These are all pictures from modern day Banda Aceh, which is, I think, a sort of a far cry from what we saw just 20 years ago. Really remarkable physical recovery. But it's also led to a real new sort of renaissance in Aceh in thinking not only about subjects like economics, law, and politics, but also of thinking about culture. And so this sort of generation that has come of age in post-tsunami Aceh has been a truly remarkable thing to watch as this sort of new post-conflict, post-tsunami generation have come into their own. they've been developing incredibly nuanced discourses on history and culture and on the interpretations of Islam to try to sort of think about how Aceh defines itself in relationship to the Indonesian nation state, but also in relation to the wider world. And this happens not only on university campuses and at big international conferences now hosted in Aceh, but also on a real grassroots level with a number of small sort of NGOs that are dedicated to preserving and documenting and discussing and developing Achenese history and culture for popular audiences all across the province. And it's for these people, this sort of new generation of Aceh, for whom the issue of the Salem seal is not simply a sort of a current events political topic, but something that has been a remarkable source of pride for many Achenese, and especially for the current generation, who see the seal as a sort of, and I realize this is very different from some of the things we're hearing in Salem, but there's a very widespread sense in Aceh that the seal represents a kind of relationship with an outside power that was not based on attempts at military invasion or colonial occupation, right? That the interactions with Salem merchants during the early 19th century are often seen in direct contrast to both the sort of the interventions of the Dutch in other parts of Sumatra before in the early 19th century and of the Dutch invasion of Aceh in the late 19th century. And so the perspective there is really seeing this as a symbol of a different way of relating to outside economic actors that was not cast in the model of occupation or colonialism, but actually seen as something that inspired a different mode of interaction with outsiders, especially with Western outsiders. I worry I may have gone a little bit long, so I think perhaps I should wrap things up right now here. And I thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. So yeah, I think we can just open up the floor for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Michael, very much. That was really fascinating. Something I definitely was not aware of. You know, especially the deep history with the independence of the Aceh people and how they do have a long line of resisting sort of foreign influence in that way, and seeing who was successful and who was not. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I find it fascinating too that that organization had a dove of peace with a olive branch in its mouth, very similar to what we see on the Salem seal.
Yeah, no, actually when I attended that conference, one of the organizers pointed out that was a very deliberate choice. Again, right, really reflecting how much the resonance of that seal actually really carries among a lot of young Achenese today. Yeah, but yeah, it's good eyes on that. Yeah.
That's fascinating. That's really cool. So that is a direct relation there. That iconography was taken directly as a reference from the
Yeah,
seal.
I mean these aren't gospel readers, right? They don't really, the dove of peace thing really comes from a very distinctive line in Achenese society, right?
Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yes, is that Suzanne?
I was late
Yeah.
to reading the email today, and I noticed that you asked to see the letter from the governor of Aceh that was written to pretty much everybody in the government in Massachusetts,
Oh,
Salem. So recently we were made aware of a video that shows the public caning of two 20-year-old Achenese men who had been caught kissing.
mhm.
And as you may know, the governor of Aceh, whose government is responsible for inflicting such punishments, wrote a letter to the governor of Massachusetts and CC'd it to the mayor of Salem, the Salem city councilors, Congressman Seth Moulton, and our U.S. senators Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey. His letter made a case for maintaining the Achenese representation on the Salem City Seal and promoted the establishment of a sister city relationship with Salem. Now, something that you might not know because you've been away for some years is that the LGBTQ plus community openly live in Salem. They serve in the Salem government and as well as the state government, something that the governor of Aceh may not have known when he addressed our governor, Mara Healy. Salem's LGBTQ plus community enjoys really strong support and inclusion, and most Salem's residents would be horrified and outraged by the public caning of a young person for a kiss. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on this are. You spoke a little bit about the religious aspect of Aceh and Islam and Sharia law, but I'd just like to hear why uh, how this is how this relates to Salem.
Yeah. So my email wasn't, I didn't know that that was the governor's letter. It sounded like there was another letter submitted thing. I do know the governor's letter sort of quite well because this is a very common topic of discussion in Aceh. So after part of the post-tsunami, let me go back. So I've got a whole book called Sharia and Social Engineering that I published in 2013, which talks about the establishment of this new modern legal system in Aceh. And this new legal system was implemented after the tsunami as a sort of a part of the sort of attempts at establishing a new post-tsunami social order. Uh, but it was something that was incredibly controversial within Aceh itself. And in fact, public canings are something that is, let's say public canings are something that many Achenese themselves are mortified by and do not see as appropriate at all. They are the laws on the books. Um, but there's a huge amount of diversity in Aceh about that. And so this sort of anti-gay, and it's not just anti-gay, people are also campaigned, unmarried heterosexual couples are also subject to caning in Aceh, right? That this is not simply an LGBTQ issue, but this is something, one of the reasons you get so much resistance to it in Aceh is this is the same thing that can happen for unmarried couples who can't prove that they're married holding hands on the beach in Aceh, right? So this is a legal system and a very self-consciously Islamic legal system that does have those laws on the books, but which themselves, and I think Americans at this point should really understand that the difference between the laws in the books and state action are by no means reflective of the sentiments of the population at large. Right? I think right now, Americans more than anybody else should realize that sometimes governments can do rather awful things in the name of a people who fundamentally do not agree with them. Right? And I think that has to be, we have to hold folks to a similar standard, I think, across the board. Now, in terms of Salem's LGBT community in Salem, yes, I've been away for quite a long time, but a number of my best friends in Salem who I'm still very much in touch with every time I go home are rather active members of the LGBTQ community in Salem. That they've also read my books about Aceh for 2 decades and know a lot about my work there. And so I think that there is a sort of a considerable amount of nuance and understanding cultural difference, right? Now, I'm not going to comment on, I didn't know about the, or I'm not going to comment on the notion of a sister city thing. I don't think sister city agreements are all that useful in any event. And that's a whole other issue than the Salem Task Force, which I'm not on. All I can say is that, yes, that as I mentioned before in my presentation, Islamic law is an important part right now. Well, Islam is an important part of Achenese identity. But among Achenese Muslims, there's still considerable debate against this legal system that is in place. But it is the legal system that's in place. And so what you're getting, what you've been getting in Aceh for the past 20 years has been a lot of public discourse and comment and critique on that. Yeah.
I have a question. Unless you had
Okay.
a response, Suzanne, I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah.
No, I don't have a response to that.
Okay. Okay, so thank you again for that really deep historical dive into Aceh. I think it was really comprehensive. My question has to do with more back to this to the seal.
Yeah.
I think that what we've been talking about in some of the sessions that you haven't been there for, unfortunately, have been the problem of the figure itself. And it
Mhm.
hasn't really been about not wanting to have a relationship with Aceh. I think that most people agree, I think in this task force and also in Salem, that it is a really interesting and fascinating history that we have. And, we do want to honor that. But the figure has been controversial for a number of reasons. One, because members of the community have expressed that it perpetuates racist stereotypes, perhaps mostly unintentionally. And also, people from the Indonesian and like Acehnese community have said that this is not accurate. This is not an accurate representation of the costumes of this time. It is clearly like someone wearing a Chinese outfit. And so I guess my question to you is, what do you think about removing the figure? And if you feel strongly about keeping it, why is that?
Okay. So I would love, so were these Acehnese who commented on a meeting that I missed? This notion about the inaccuracy of the dress? Because I need to see this, because I haven't seen this yet. So,
This was our
the,
last meeting, actually.
okay, so that those will be in the recordings when I can access the recordings, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so I will try to sort of check that out. I mean, in the presentation that I was going to give, and that maybe I guess probably I should give, there's one of the things that I talk about there is sort of two overlapping, I think, fascinating historical bits of what goes into the seal, right? Part of what I talked about there is really about the models that Salem had to work with in terms of modeling that figure, right? And especially looking at the ways in which paintings produced by Western artists of, say, Hong merchants in Canton at about the same time were one thing that fed into the kind of visual language of producing those images. The second thing, though, is to recognize that these notions about Chinese dress, Indian dress, Arab dress, Sumatran dress weren't locked into their kind of museumized forms that we have today in the 19th century. Aceh in the early 19th century, especially the west coast of Aceh, was an incredibly prosperous society. And like prosperous kids today who want to throw in little bits of Korean fashion or little bits of, any kind of new global trends, the forms of Acehnese dress that we have in the 19th century were incredibly hybrid, right? Where textiles from India, cuts from China, head wraps from the Middle East, all of these things were coming together in very eclectic senses of a sort of a hybrid fashion, right? Um, and so I think that we've got two things, which again, if I am allowed to give that talk, I'd like to unpack on sort of two ways of one of saying that what's today canonized as ethnic dress in Aceh and how that's separated from, say, ethnic dress in other parts of Sumatra or from other parts of the Indian Ocean is largely a product of 20th century freezing of heritage, right? That the things that we worry about today in terms of, say, cultural appropriation or inappropriate borrowing or these sort of things were simply not issues in the 19th century Indian Ocean world. In fact, it was that sort of hybridity that really marked the sort of the prosperity and the dynamism of a lot of these societies, right? So the marking off of this as distinctly Arab as opposed to this as distinctly Persian, or this is distinctly Chinese, or this is distinctly Tamil, was simply not in place at that time. So I think we have to sort of realize that contextually. In terms of my own feelings about the seal, right? Sort of why I think that it probably wouldn't be a good idea to change it, um, is precisely because it reflects a sort of historical reality on the one hand, that this was a very distinct image in American history, right? That we have all kinds of seals that depict either uh, the oppression or elimination of native peoples in North America, or of this sort of conquering figure of the Western pioneer or the Western settler, right? We have lots of these horrific images on flags and symbols across the United States now. And I think that there's rightly a move to replace these because they are horrible and imperializing images. I think what's really distinctive about the Salem seal is that it depicts neither a sort of indigenous population being wiped off the map or a sort of a proud white conqueror taking control of this land. It actually makes a deliberate choice, and as far as I know, the only choice in the United States to depict a person from a completely different place. And to depict that person dressed in the garb of wealth and prosperity and respect, right? This is not a native in a loincloth, like crouched under a tree. This is a guy in very expensive clothing, some of which was probably imported, holding a parasol, which in Southeast Asia is not to just keep you out of the sun. In historical Southeast Asia, that parasol is a symbol of elite status, right? And so we have a depiction of the figure here of a prosperous elite merchant standing tall on the beach, looking out at a ship coming from Salem. And I think that is the reason I think the seal should be kept is that that is a remarkable thing in American history, right? To have the depiction of a figure on the seal who is not an indigenous person being wiped out and who is not a new conquering invader, but recognizing the importance of this proud, prosperous people in the pride and prosperity of Salem is a really unique historical artifact. And I think that
Oh,
we would be losing something if we lost that.
I hear you, and I appreciate that. I think that's really interesting about the ways that people are addressing. I think that that is really valid. I just want to point to the fact that, so you mentioned that we're, we are reassessing a lot of our Native American imagery for very good reason. But a lot of the imagery that we're reassessing doesn't just have to do with like the intent of how it was done or the history of how it was done. It has to do with the impact on communities today. And in your responses, I'm just curious because I feel that you focus a lot on history, which I understand is in your purview. But like, how then do you reconcile, for example, an image that was made with good intentions and an image that was made, um, you know, nothing was not there. I agree with you that it's, I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with that image as it is as it was intended, but then to have to live in this world now where that image still has echoes of, for example, going back to Suzanne's presentation of anti-Asian sentiment, and to have communities that have to live with that today in Salem, knowing that people feel this way, then how can you support that? I think that that's a huge question that's coming up, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Michael. I invite anyone
Yeah.
who's here
Yeah.
to
No, I mean,
respond.
I can just respond. I mean, for the one thing, I mean, one of the reasons why, I sort of reconsidered, I think my natural tendencies, especially like with all of these things on, say, the Massachusetts flag and other shield symbol, like my natural tendencies are to say, yeah, that's a problem. We need to address that. But the fact that so many people in Aceh seem overwhelmingly proud of the seal, right? And Aceh is in Asia, right? That there's so many people of Asian descent, especially the people who are purportedly depicted by the seal, um, who don't see this as an image of othering or stereotyping or I mean, I think the fact that so many people there don't see this in that way gives me pause to sort of reconsider, right? So that's one of the things is that, this isn't a thing that every Asian you meet is immediately sort of put off by this. In fact, the fact that they have such a completely different reading of this, I think really gives me pause to reconsider that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I do have to say that, especially now, and I don't know how political I can be in this forum, but when we have the executive branch of the federal government attempting to take over the Smithsonian to effectively rewrite history to fit contemporary political concerns, right? What's going on now with the Smithsonian is absolutely abhorrent, right? The sort of notion that we need to remake history in the image that makes us feel better is a very dangerous thing for our country, full stop. And I think as a principled stand, it's very hard for me to say it's okay when the change is in a liberal progressive direction that I like, and to be as sort of, and then and to be so critical of when this is happening in directions that I don't like, right? So for me, the sort of default inertial setting is not to rewrite history, but to create more critical interpretive discourses on that history so we understand it, which is what the Smithsonian has been doing, for example, with the issue of slavery for many years now, in which the current administration wants to roll back. Right? I really think that more critical interpretation, more critical discourse on this thing that exists is going to be much more helpful for our civic culture in the long run than simply changing those things that might make us uncomfortable today.
I mean, I just want to address one thing, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to other people who I'm sure have more questions for you. But I actually did live in Asia for about 5 years where I worked.
Yeah.
I lived in Vietnam and I lived in Taiwan. And so I feel that I can speak particularly clearly on this matter of perspective. I think that there's a huge difference between people who live in a society where they don't have the same types of racism, for example. Yet, so I would say that like there is a difference between the perspective of someone who's living in America, an Asian person living in America, even if they're not American. But a lot of Vietnamese, for example, I was just in Vietnam for a research trip earlier this year, and I was talking to a friend of a friend who was talking about their trip to Sicily, and they said they had just been treated just horribly, right? They had gone to restaurants, people had refused to serve them, and this was one of their first experiences having that kind of prejudice. So on one hand, I just want to point that out because I think that there's been a lot of emphasis, in my opinion, I think maybe a little bit too much emphasis on how Achinese people feel about the seal. But we also really want to focus on people who are living in Salem and who are experiencing things in the Salem on the ground. And that is a very different perspective.
Right. But just in closing, so the Achenese are not trapped in a bubble of Aceh. In fact, when some of the speakers who I did recognize at that listening session have lived for extended periods in the United States. So Asna Hussein, for example, has been resident in Washington, D.C. for almost 2 decades now. Reza Israel got his PhD in the United States, as have a number of other people there. So these are folks who've lived in the United States. Also, so I live in Japan now, but I had spent 5 years at Oxford before I came here in the UK. And my kids, who were basically raised in Singapore their entire life, when we moved to the UK, they also had that jarring experience of, for the first time, encountering anti-Asian racism. I remember when my son came back from his first week of school in the UK and had to ask me, Papa, what is chinky? Because he was subjected not just to racism, but to like old-timey 1930s racism when he showed up at the school in the UK. So, I get those dynamics. But what I'm saying is that, for example, a lot of these people who've gone to the West, who have had those horrible experiences, and who still have come back to Aceh, who have come back to Japan, do not necessarily feel that same way about the impression that gives, right? That even having, after experiencing direct and horribly offensive and hurtful racism in the West, that's not the only reaction, I think, that many people have to the seal, including those people of Asian descent who are living in places like the United States or the UK and facing that sort of horrendous treatment, right? I don't think that there's a straight line between those. That's all I'll say. Sorry. Should we open up for more questions from
Yeah, and
others?
I think just for the sake of time, Aditi, we'll take your question and then maybe that we can wrap up this agenda item.
Okay, thank you. I also just want to echo that was a really informative presentation. I guess like one of the questions I have is like we have sort of skimmed, we talked about the Dutch and the British a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe the timeline leaves out the Americans and one of the questions I had is like, the first thing you said was the Achenese people see the Salem Seal as relations to an outside power, but not based on military intervention, unlike the Dutch and the British, right? Is this based on some type of survey or is this anecdotal information? Like, and I
Yeah.
also have a follow-up with that, but I'll let you answer that one first.
Okay. So, I mean, part of it is based on what we heard at the listening session there, right? Where overwhelmingly the voices of Aceh were talking about how the Salem seal is very different. And across Aceh, so I was just, back in Sumatra for a good stretch of this summer. Um, and people know that I'm from Salem, and people often invited me to go and talk at NGOs and universities and things like this. And that was the overwhelming sentiment I heard from almost everybody on the ground there. And what's interesting is that this wasn't simply a kind of wishful thinking, right? That most of the people who engage on the subject, they know about, for example, the interventions at Kuala Batu, right? But they also know, for example, about the blowback that the Kuala Batu invasion got in the United States, right? And sort of contextualizing not just that military incursion, but also the sort of blowback this got in the public sphere in the United States as a sign that this was not what the project of the Salem traders were about. And so, in fact, in 1873, on the eve of the Dutch invasion of Aceh, the Achenese Sultan actually sent 3 diplomats to Singapore to approach the American consul in Singapore to ask them to defend them against Dutch incursions, right? And so we see that, going back through the 19th century, the horrific event of the bombardments of Kuala Batu uh, were seen as an exception rather than the model. Because, for example, with the Portuguese, with the Dutch, with the English, we have legacies of them building forts and warehouses and cannons and, all of that sort of material accoutrement of colonial occupation scattered all over the country. But we just did a thorough LIDAR and archaeological field survey of the Kuala Batu site this past month. Um, and what we find there are sort of the only things that look like fortifications are sort of earthenwork fortified warehouses for storing pepper around the estuary where stock was brought down and kept waiting for it to be sent out to sea. And we don't see any evidence there whatsoever of attempts to create a sort of an American beachhead on Aceh. And I think that notion, that sort of idea that's often talked about in Aceh is the fact that we don't have any attempt to kind of settle and colonize and build new plantations is something that in a majority of Achenese minds, it appears, is simply what distinguishes the Salem encounter from that of the British, the Dutch, or even attempts by the Portuguese before them.
Okay. I mean, I struggle with this idea that a little bit of violence is justified when compared to a larger scale violence of like the Dutch and the British, because there were still 2 expeditions, and the language that Endicott used in his diary, calling them savages, dirty. And then I read another account from Paul Daxel in 1899, who's an American author who translated a Dutch military officer's work that was really popular during the time. Excerpts from it was published in the Boston Herald, and local news talks about just gendered violence, sexual violence of a 16-year-old a Chinese woman of the time. And these are just witnessed by Americans. Maybe they weren't colonizing military officers themselves, but they were passing through. And I wish, part of it, what you're saying is that, Michael, you might have the foresight and the information, and you've written books about it, and you have an academic expertise on the topic. But that's what I struggle with, is when lay people just look at this image and are encountering what you call the small amount of violence, right? Like, it's just 2 expeditions, right? That's not a big deal
It's
compared
not
to
that
the
it's
Brits and the Dutch. Like, they didn't fortify, they didn't, I really struggle with this idea that, you know, and again, I feel really scared that Chinese voices are being pitted against the voices here in Salem, because somehow this little bit of violence is acceptable, or I don't know how this narrative has come about, but I don't agree that the two expeditions and the language that was used by Endicott, by American authors of the time was appropriate. That's what I have to contend with when I live here and look at that image. So I'm just gonna, apologize, but please go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah. So there was no justifying what happened, right? There's no justifying this. This isn't an idea about a little bit of violence. It's about a distinction between an occupying colonial force and another kind of violence. What I find really interesting in Aceh is how many of the discussions by people who've been posting online, like by Cooney, for example, right? Who look at the incursions at the American incursions at Kuala Batu and read those alongside, say, articles in the abolitionist newspaper, the New York Observer, right? Which talk about the Americans who heard about the violence from Warner's account when it was published in the US, and then immediately start acts of civil resistance and protest against the use of violence at Kuala Batu, an event against this sort of projection of American military power abroad, right? That they're not justifying it, but what they see as important is the reaction that engendered from American civil society at the time, right? That's not justifying the violence. It's saying that that violence was part of a bigger story that actually spurred a significant amount of American public discourse in critiquing that vision of a use of force. That's not making that violence okay, but it's actually telling a really interesting story about a time in American history when there was enough care about people in Aceh to mobilize citizens' resistance in the US against that kind of projection of force, right? It's that
Okay.
kind of story that I think makes that very interesting. Now, the other thing I need to ask you about is what is this thing you said about people in Aceh being pitted
Right. I mean, it
against
just
Salem?
seems
What?
like Salem somehow owes it to the Chinese people to keep the seal if the residents of Salem are opposed to it. Specifically, if Asian members of the Salem community find it offensive. And it feels like somehow, Michael, I don't want to make any assumptions about your cultural roots, but you don't look like me. You don't look like Rachel. You don't look like Pucci. You don't look like Rahina. And you're the representation of the voice of Aceh in some ways to say that, hey, it's okay. And I mean it in the best way possible. I also want to really be respectful of your time and your knowledge. So, but at the end of the day, what I see at the end result is that folks who raised this issue have been sidestepped repeatedly to center voices of people from halfway across the world. This was a Salem resident conversation. I also don't want to add to this that any one of us who's spoken in favor of wanting to change the seal, Michael, has been harassed relentlessly. I wish I could show you the images. I would invite you to just go look at Facebook groups. I have screenshots and I feel so powerless that someone who looks like me, who lives in this city, is made to feel this way just for bringing up an issue and wanting things to change here.
Okay. I don't have Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or TikTok or any of these
I'm
things. So
happy to mail you the
if you could
pictures.
send me,
I'm happy
if
to
you could
mail you
send me
the
some screenshot,
comments.
if you could send me some screenshots, I would really appreciate it. Um, in terms of me being the representation of Aceh, that's something that I've been worried about from the very beginning. One of the reasons that I wanted to be on the task force was to try to open up a door for some Achenese voices to be heard. And that's why I've been, I circulated the notice about the formation of the task force. I circulated the notice about the listening session, precisely so that I would not be the voice. What I wanted to do was to make sure some people from Aceh were heard, because if we're doing all of this, especially under Regina's office, under the under the notions about including a diversity of opinion, of being broadly inclusive and equitable of considerations from really truly diverse viewpoints, I thought it was really a problem to exclude those people who are purportedly the ones who are being depicted by the seal. I thought if we're really true to our mandate and we really truly want to accommodate a diversity of voices, that we should be open to this, especially for the people who are themselves directly represented and for whom a huge sort of emotional investment is made. And so one of the things I've been very conscious of, and the reason that until today I've been really trying to focus specifically on the history, which is what I've been trained in working on, is to let the sort of, discourse about feelings be as broadly inclusive as possible. That being said, I do feel like now I need to say something. It was meant with no disrespect, but evaluating my input based on, what was the term, the color of my skin rather than the content of my character, right? Seeing that somehow because I look like this, that I'm necessarily in a kind of assumed positionality on this issue, I do find very troubling. That's a kind of sentiment that I really cannot just let slip, right? If this entire thing is simply about the secondary physical characteristics of race that we display physically, I think that bodes very, very ominously for any kind of civic discussion. And at a time when the United States is in such an incredibly fraught position, with the absolute breakdown of any capacity for civic discourse, and about a kind of extreme politicization of race that, as we see on everything from immigration to urban policing, is absolutely horrendous in the United States right now. I don't think that we want to get on that same page in terms of how we elaborate our critiques. Um, you know, I that's all I have to say.
Want
I
to
mean,
respond and sorry, I just want to respond and say that I will emphasize this again. The folks who have spoken in favor of wanting the seal to change have been harassed, criticized. We've been called the lowest rung of the gene pool. Michael, I don't want to make it about race, but when people like me are called that, the lowest rung of the gene
No,
pool,
that
I
is
don't know what to do.
that
You
is
tell me.
completely that's
I also have a doctorate. I've
yeah.
also gotten an education. I've lived in Malacca. My parents raised me in Malaysia and Singapore as well. You know, I'd like to see myself as an international, global nomad, for a better word, similar to you. But I mean no disrespect when I say that again. But so have been a lot of people of color here subjected to unkind remarks, just
No, that is
unkind
truly
to the
that's
anonymity because of the anonymity of the internet. And I wish you could extend that sympathy to us as well a little
no,
bit,
I
right?
I don't. I definitely extend that sympathy. There's absolutely no excuse for that sort of behavior. There's no there's no excusing here that behavior, right? And from the very first session when we talked about, the importance of feelings, right? That we were all on the same page to agree that this was a very valid part of the conversation. There's no, again, I don't understand why there's an assumption that somehow I'm okay with that sort of thing. That is simply not acceptable in any form of public discourse.
Thank you for saying that.
yeah, and I think I think this whole conversation about the City Seal Task Force and the City Seal specifically is about race equity, right? Like that's why the matter was referred to the Race Equity Commission, and then the Race Equity Commission made a formal recommendation to the City Council. So it's not like we can separate race and the conversation about race and racism from this conversation. Like it's very much
Yeah.
a part of it, right? So yeah, like just like Aditi was saying, there are realities that we as people of color face, right? And I think that's just important to note that it's not really possible to separate the conversation about race and race equity from the conversation of the seal. And I also just want to mention that it sounds like what Aditi's saying is that the voices of Asian Americans living in Salem, it sounds like they've been silenced in this process, right? And so how can we take that into consideration as we move forward in our dialogue about the city seal? I also just want to recognize that we're
Out
we're
of time.
really, yeah, we're kind of
But
we've gone over.
Poochie did have a hand up earlier, though.
Yes. So Poochie, would you mind closing us out with a question or comment?
Sure, just tying it back to the conversations around kind of values and bringing this up to more of that kind of contemporary context, but we didn't quite get into, and it goes back to kind of the current, I guess, yeah, value system of the people today. It is Sharia law. There's no doubt about that from what, 2001, you said, post the tragedy there. So is it a democratic voting system, and what keeps that special autonomy specific to Aceh when it comes to Sharia law? And the comment that you made was that, a lot of the people who live there may or may not support it, but certainly a majority does to keep this system going, which, depending on what your knowledge of it or understanding of it are, sometimes, at least for me personally, kind of at odds of the freedoms I've grown up with as a woman, as a person of color, in the United States. So I'm just kind of curious, what would it take if there's that many people who maybe don't support the values of what their government does, that it's still kind of a special autonomous region specific to Aceh and not for the rest of Indonesia?
Yeah. So very briefly, so this is another one of these issues too, where I do think that people living in the contemporary United States will probably have a lot more insight into this than people living just about anywhere else, right? In terms of how a majority of people feel that the state mandated enforcement of cultural values is opposite to the direction that they think the country should be moving in for. So the special autonomy deal was in a sense given to Aceh by the central government. Many in Aceh would say it was imposed by the central government as part of the attempts at trying to, in a sense, countervene the Free Aceh movement, right? That the idea was the Free Aceh movement was getting too strong. The Indonesian government said, okay, fine, here's your special autonomy, and we're going to give you Sharia law coming from Jakarta. Now, many GAM activists at the time called that the quote unquote unwanted gift from Jakarta, right? And if we do take that cynical political reading, this was something that was not, that was in a sense imposed from Jakarta, then it may have been a brilliant stroke of policy by the central government in terms of quashing dissent in Aceh. For this reason, Aceh is a fully democratic province. They have had, since 2024, 5 elections for the regional assembly and for the governorship, and it has changed political parties almost every single time, right? So there is quite a bit of overturn in the government. The issue is that with the now implantation of Sharia law as the constitutional format, the constitutional framework of Aceh, it becomes a very difficult space for launching public opposition. One of the things I think people outside don't really understand is that if you ask a Muslim about, do you like Sharia, right? Or do you want Sharia? The answer is going to be overwhelmingly yes, because in that case, Sharia doesn't mean caning kissing couples, or Sharia doesn't mean you cannot buy a beer. That on those kinds of public opinion polls, Sharia reads more like democracy, or I would say freedom in the United States, right? Freedom is seen as such a powerful master signifier, right? That if people say this is about freedom, people will say yes to almost anything, right? And we've seen the cancerous things about this in the States. Sharia, to many Muslims across the world today, reads like that. They don't think of Sharia primarily in terms of the specific details that might get imposed by a regressive or repressive government, right? They think of Sharia as the ultimate good, the way they should live their life. And within Muslim societies, there's such an incredible, this is what I spent most of my life working on, right? There's such an incredible diversity of opinion within the Muslim world about what constitutes Sharia. The reason I got into this field was I was fascinated by those arguments, right? I grew up in a very Catholic family that was always arguing about religion. And when I found another bunch of people who were always arguing about religion, I thought this was a fascinating thing to study. And so there's a huge amount of internal debate, including over things like the caning punishments for anything about gender norms and LGBT rights. There's a huge amount of internal diversity. But once that is established as the law of the land, the constitutional framework of the land, it becomes incredibly hard to challenge, because anytime you challenge Sharia, it's like challenging freedom in the rhetorical sphere of public discourse in Aceh. And so there are lots of projects attempting reform. But just like in the United States, it's a very, very fraught sphere of political contestation right now.
Okay, well, thank you. Oh, Dakota, jump in, Dakota,
Hi,
and then we
Dakota.
really have
I'm
to
so
cut
sorry.
Okay,
people
and then
off.
I'll make all my
I
answers
want
now
us to
really
move on,
short.
but it
I'm
led
also going
into
to
a
go to work
question that
soon.
I had when I was on the road.
Sorry, Dakota,
Yes.
please.
Oh, no problem. So I think real briefly, and I'm going to ask you to speculate just a little bit here, Michael, is, I think we've heard time and again, in the listening session and from here, one of the reasons why this is important to, especially the younger people in Aceh is this representation on the world stage. And I think answering that last question, it made me really start to wonder again, like, how does contemporary Aceh want to be seen on the world stage? What kind of representation, what kind of depiction are they looking for? What kind of values do they want out there? And I know that's asking a lot to speculate there, but
Yeah.
I'd be
Well, I mean,
interested in your take on that.
yeah. So I don't really need to speculate because I can just think about what gets said in all of these public forums in Aceh. And like I said, again, I'm not online, so I can't speak to the online discourse. But in terms of these meetings at NGOs and university campuses and things like this, the major thing that Acehnese want to be known for is their kind of independence and their cosmopolitanism, right? So one of the things, so very often when there's a kind of a folk etymology, this is not historical at all, but it's a very popular trope in contemporary Acehnese discourse. People will say, you know what Aceh is? Aceh stands for Arabs, Chinese, Europeans, Europa, and Hindia in Indians, right? That they sort of try to make this kind of catchphrase about Aceh's cosmopolitanism, right? About the mixed roots of civilization in Aceh, about the kinds of historic relations that they've had, not with just the colonizers of the British and the Dutch and the Portuguese, but with Chinese merchants and Indian merchants and Arab merchants and Salem merchants, right? That this sort of notion about cosmopolitanism and openness is very important to Acehnese identity. The notion that they are independent and have always tried to maintain their independence is very important to Acehnese identity. And the fact that they are Muslims is the third major component of Acehnese identity. And I think these are the three things that are most prominent in local debates. And like I said, inside of which there's incredible debates among Acehnese themselves of what it means to be independent, right? Like what's their relationship now with the Indonesian state? That's a big topic of conversation. And what does their Islam look like, right? Recognizing the sort of plurality of Islams around the world, what do they want Acehnese Islam to look like? And so I think those are the major conversations that I've kind of had my ear on there for a while.
Okay.
Thanks, that's helpful. I think, one of the things that is a little bit of a separation that sort of, where it might not be clear where Aditi's coming from to you is if you aren't in those online spaces and you
Yeah.
aren't here in Salem, I feel like in a big way, the Acehnese people don't want it to change has become sort of the default argument of the question shouldn't be even be raised, right? And
Well,
I think that
I sincerely hope that's not the case because that's not the point at all, right? I
well,
mean, the
no, and
point.
I don't think that's necessarily coming from a place of thoughtfulness on the part of the folks making that argument. I think it's coming from a place of, well, I personally don't want it to change, and here are some other people who feel that way as well, right? You know, and I think that's a thing that's lost. So I think that's where Aditi, I think, is coming from when she says, you know, we feel like these voices are being prioritized over Asian American voices here in Salem. And I think it's important to understand, like, to be able to separate, you know, what do the Achenese people care about, what do they want to see, from just sort of this argument of the Achenese people don't want it to change, you know, to give them a little bit of dimension. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
I would
think,
very, yeah, I'd very much welcome it in the front, like for me to stand back and to have, you know, more direct engagement with people from Aceh. I think that would be, I'd be very happy if I was obsolete on this committee, quite frankly. Yeah.
okay, everyone. So I think we have to close this agenda item. So thank you everybody for that discussion, and thank you so much, Michael, for your presentation and for fielding all those questions. I think right now we're just scheduled to take a 5-minute break. So if people just want to come back in 5 minutes at 5:37, and then we can continue. All right.
Okay. I also just want to quickly mention that I might have to leave in another like 15-20 minutes because I have to go to a clinical, like my work.
Yes, understandable. And yes, it's totally fine. And we have the recording and the AI going. So thanks, Aditi.
Thanks, Aditi.
Okay, so yeah, it looks like everybody is back. So I'm just going to dive into the next agenda item. So the next item on the agenda is a discussion and vote on the report timeline for the City Seal Task Force. And so here's what we currently have scheduled between now and October. We have a hybrid listening session in the annex on September 18th, which we'll talk about in a minute, well, at the next agenda item. Then we have a tabling event at the Community Life Center. We also have our special meeting with Erica Lee, as well as VJ leading a discussion. And then we also have another listening session on the 14th. There's a minor error. It's not on the 13th, it's on the 14th, so just that was a typo. And then we have our next regular meeting on October 20th. So I'd like to ask, does this capture everything, or are there any pieces missing that we should add? And if looking at this timeline, do you think we will be ready to, at our next regular meeting in October, to schedule a formal vote on a recommendation to the City Council?
I'm gonna repeat what I sort of said in the past, which is that to think that we are coming to an end and to vote on it right now and to have it's not right now and the next meeting, I feel like it's kind of presumptuous, especially with the fact that Michael Feener's just returned to us. Noreen is just joining us. We have another second new task force member as well, and so we're here for 18 months, and so I'm sort of wondering why if we're asking by October if we're going to be done. I'm not quite sure about that.
I don't think we're here for 18 months. I think we're up to 18 months. The other thing I also just want to add to this is that I do not want to quit this task force, but the toll of the harassment time and again, I don't want to endure it for much longer. And I don't think that, I think that learning is lifelong. I really do. As someone who's, continues to read and learn more about, the relationship of Sumatra and Salem, as well as, even like learning more about my, Asian American heritage. I think that all of those topics are lifelong. I don't think that we'd even be able to exhaust it in 18 months, let alone 18 years. So given all of those constraints, I am in favor of taking a vote sooner than later. Whatever it might be, whatever stand we might take, but go ahead.
Noreen, go ahead. Noreen, yeah.
I appreciate that I am just coming to the table, but I will say that I went back and read minutes from all the previous meetings. I feel like I'm up to speed. And my understanding was that we are being compelled, may be a strong word, but my understanding is that we are to come to a decision by next month. And, again, this is my first meeting. I don't want to make assumptions, but it seems pretty clear to me from minutes I've read and other listening sessions I've watched that people have pretty strong ideas. I think we could take a vote today, frankly, but I'm happy to wait till next month and learn more. And I agree with Aditi. Learning is lifelong. We're not going to resolve this next month. We have a simple decision to make. In my mind, a simple decision. It's a yay or a nay, and I appreciate Michael's historic perspective, but frankly, I can't imagine that the people of Aceh really give a damn about what's on the Salem, Massachusetts City Seal. I certainly have no clue what's on their city seal, nor do I feel like I have any say in the matter, even though we have a historic relationship. That's me.
All right, so then we have Michael and Dakota.
Wow. Um, wow. Um, the reason I've been trying to get Achenes to engage directly with this is to give a sense of just how important this issue is for them there, right? I mean, as VJ noticed on the thing, right? Even the incorporation of some of that iconography into very contemporary designs there, this is something that is a major issue for people there, right?
How does this impact them, Michael? Can you explain to me how this impacts them?
Yeah, yes, it does. So we get a society there of people who are now been spent the last 20 years recovering from the two incredibly traumatic events of a massive loss of life from the tsunami and the horrors of war and sexualized violence under the Indonesian attempts to restore control over the province. This is a sort of an entire generation who've been very deeply searching for ways to define themselves in the society in relation to a broader world beyond one of death and destruction. And so the Salem seal has been picked up as something that is a topic of very broad public interest. I mean, this is something that you see, people debating on campus, you see people debating in NGOs. This is a major sort of issue there. And one of the reasons that I thought it was important that Achenes knew that there was a listening session to try to have their voices heard was to give a sense of how important that was for them. So,
And I think we've
um,
accomplished that, right? We've had Chinese voices come. In fact, more so, like from the stats that I presented in August, that 10 people spoke from Salem, 22
yeah,
people represented Aceh. Also,
yeah,
like, historically like statistically speaking, we're a drop in a bucket. Again, I don't think that we're going to be able, like, I don't think that, like, if someone's trying to start a global movement to not change or change the Salem City Seal, like, I don't personally have, I also just want to say, Michael, not that I don't care, but I have no say in Indonesian, a small town in Indonesia somewhere who's trying to change city seal or a flag imagery or whatever. So we've had, and much to your hard work, we've had 22 people, Chinese people, come and talk to us. And we can factor that in to,
yeah. No, and
as we
Rod,
have, as we've
I just
conveyed
want to
our,
respond. I just want to respond to Noreen's point about
I got you.
that this isn't an issue there because it is clearly an issue there that I can't have a cup of coffee anywhere in the province without somebody going, "You're the guy from Salem." Right? So this is something that is on public interest. I'm just responding to that
Right, right,
point.
right.
Mhm.
Fair enough.
Sorry, Dakota, I think is next.
Dakota and then Rachel.
Uh, so I think I just wanted to sort of reiterate my position, which I think I've expressed in previous meetings, is that like getting to like a yay or nay vote matters a little less to me because I don't think a simple yay or nay tells the city council much except how everybody on this panel feels, you know. That said, I think that we've hit, or are beginning to hit the limits of our information gathering phase right here. And I think we need to start putting these arguments down on paper. And that's what's really going to, in my opinion, help the city council as they move ahead is say, not only here's how we feel, but these are why we feel it. And being able to have our arguments and counter arguments and then our ultimate recommendations is sort of what's important to me. And I feel like probably sooner than later is the right time to start moving into that phase of the work of this committee.
Rachel and then Suzanne.
I just want to say that I also think we have to take into consideration how much time that we've spent in this task force, even though, sure, we can look at it and say, it was under the 18 months, but we've had so many additional meetings, and also we've had our in-person tabling events. And I have to say, our meetings are like marathon meetings. I doubt every city task force meets for 2.5 to 3 hours at a time. Um, and I agree with Dakota. I think that we have reached the point where, Regina and I, and with, maybe with you guys, I don't know who's on this, but we're also reaching out via email to other organizations, to nonprofits, asking for them for an input. Um, so we are trying to gather as much as we can, and we've reached a great deal of people in a very short time from all of these hours that every person has put in at this task force. So I do support that that we make a decision next month.
Suzanne, go ahead.
Um, well, I would hope that Professor Feener would go back and look at some of our presentations because I feel it may not seem like it's been a big investment of our time to you, but you've only been here once. This is your second time coming, and we've been here a lot, hours and hours and hours. And there's a lot of labor that went into the presentations and research, and I hope that you will look at them. I hope you'll look at mine because I'm like you, a professor, tenured, 35 years. Uh, and I also have had thousands and thousands of students. And I have had thousands of students of color and from AAPI and LGBTQ because I'm in a state college system. And I know that they've been hurt by racist imagery, especially in illustrations of themselves. And that's what the seal is it's an illustration. It's a lovely illustration. It's very skillfully rendered, nice analogous colors in the watercolor, luminous, good use of type. But that doesn't negate the message of I think pictures are very, very strong delivery systems for messages to people on a subliminal level. So I would encourage you to look at that because it may seem to people who are just coming in now that this is brief and fast, but it doesn't feel that way to me. And the other thing I would ask Rahina is in considering when we're going to wrap things up, how much time do you think it's going to take to write a report and who's going to do that?
So just to address that question specifically, I think it's up to us. So we already have a draft that Dakota helped us put together. It's not a draft, it's a very rough outline, I would call it. And I think we'd probably have to schedule another special meeting to talk through that and to talk about basically a division of labor. But I think probably all of us would have to be involved in writing at least a section of it, right? So it would have to be definitely a collective effort, and we would have to talk more about who's doing what.
Hey y'all, I have to leave and I would really like to vote on this if possible. So could we please just take a vote on deciding whether we're gonna take a vote in October? And folks can carry a conversation even if you don't want to take a vote, I hope can we introduce a motion to take a vote?
So I think we have to listen to Michael and VJ before we
I
can
got you.
formally do that. But please go ahead, Michael, and then VJ, and then we can take a vote.
I'll try to make this as brief as possible. For the record, I've been here for more than 2 meetings. I missed 2 meetings in a row because I was in very isolated areas. I've been making efforts to get up at either 2:30 in the morning or 4:30 in the morning for a long time to make sure that I'm at these. And until I lost connection to the drive, I had been looking at all the previous presentations, just to be clear on that. I'd also like this to end because it's exhausting. It's exhausting for me to try to travel through Aceh without getting buttonholed at every single place I stop to talk about this. It's also been exhausting to get these messages of sort of, what can I say, sort of accusatory remarks towards my character and my positionality, right? These things that have been said about, my friends both in Salem and Aceh have laughed when they heard that I
Michael,
was
you're not
manipulating.
alone. You're not alone
So,
in that.
so I think we're all exhausted from that.
Yeah.
That being said, I do not think that we are ready to take a vote in October. I think that looking over sort of what we have here, I think that rushing um, is unwarranted in terms of the state of the discussions so far to date. And I also think that rushing that, if we're worried about blowback and more feedback for the community, accusations of having, say, rammed this through before proper vote, especially because it was publicly announced that we had an 18-month stand. I don't want to go to the full 18 months. I'd be exhausted. I couldn't do that. But I do think rushing this for October would be bad in the long run.
Go ahead, VJ.
Thank you. Yeah, Michael, I agree absolutely with the latter point there. Also, last meeting, I just introduced some of the very first sources that are starting to focus our discussion to the local level. So far, up to last meeting, it's been the 30,000-foot view of what racist imagery does. And we have yet to even touch upon how the local perspective of the creation of the seal came to be. So that's where, to even bring up the topic of a vote saying that we've had enough time is, to me, just it's offensive to the historical process for what our vote is then going to be on the record for in perpetuity. And I want to echo Michael's point about, if we were to end this vote, if we were to take this vote to end it now, we're just going to be seeing much more hate and vitriol than might already be had. So
I don't agree with you on that one, VJ. I know that because you've expressed favor towards wanting to keep the seal, you haven't been subjected to some of the stuff. And I will make it a point to forward you and Michael both, the things that have been said online. I don't think I can, and I think that much like me, I don't know how much other people can take it too, to constantly to be subjected to that kind of stuff. I can't even go online. I walk around thinking that someone's going to say something, corner me and say something. Michael, you've had people say, "Oh, tell us about, your role and so many, exciting things about your, taking the initiative to bring this to the task force in Salem." Guess what? We've been called, again, I quote, lowest of the gene pool, lowest side of the gene pool. How do you think that makes me feel?
I know.
I don't want to hang around. And I really do want to learn. So if you want to, if you host a seminar through the Pickering House, or you can, Salem 400's coming up. There are so many different venues to do the educational and awareness piece of it that would be much more engaging than time and again these online 3-hour meetings. And the
Yeah,
fall is also a really busy
yeah,
time for a lot of people in
yeah.
academia and
I,
like in the
I,
world of work.
yes,
I just want to say that.
Okay.
I
What, so
completely sympathize on all points. I'm insanely busy. These are really inconvenient hours. And I am personally exhausted by these impugnations of my character, talking about how I'm manipulating public opinion and actually things. It's exhausting to hear these hurtful things launched against me. I also desperately want it to be over. But I think it's our
So let's do
responsibility
it.
to execute, I think it's our responsibility to responsibly execute our duty.
I should
No
mention
matter.
as well. Oh, I'm sorry, Michael. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I should mention as well that lower level of the gene pool comment, that's directed at me too. You don't think that in all the comments that are
Yeah, that was
generalized toward us,
specifically directed at people who were going to say that the seal should change.
the
And
City
based
SEAL
on a
Task
picture
Force,
of me, Suzanne, Rachel, Dakota, who
and
it was on an image on the internet where somebody from as a resident from Salem said that. Okay, it wasn't directed at you. Absolutely, I understand. In essence, perhaps it was because they don't know your stance. But those of us who have been even slightly vocal,
okay.
it's as much. Sorry, I'll back up.
Yeah, no, it's just I think we need to, take it take this down and just ground ourselves in the original values and norms that we put forward. I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of feelings around how this has affected each and one of us individually, right? Like, and all of those feelings are valid, right? And I think we've kind of reached a point where we have to make a decision on how to move forward for the sake of our mental health, quite frankly, and and yeah, we can, just like Aditi said, there has been a lot that's been done already. So I think let's just ground ourselves in the values that we put forth at the beginning of this. And Dakota, I'll let you speak. Go ahead.
I wonder if we might have a little compromise that maybe expresses my position a little better not necessarily a point at which we have to vote yay or nay, and that's our final vote, but could we at least vote on a timeline to sort of wind things down at the very least, to say, hey, we're moving into a secondary phase of this, and we're aware at the end of that is going to be a vote here, but I would like to see more of a timeline on our work that wraps things up a little more in line with the timeline that we're talking right here, because I think we're at a reporting out phase at this point.
Well, and we still are having another speaker with Erica Lee, who I'm really excited to hear from. She's a Harvard historian teaching at Harvard, and she's also in the AAPI community. So we haven't heard from a scholar in the AAPI community that's a historian.
Well, isn't
Well,
Dr. Michael Feener exactly that?
Well, Michael Feener has all three of his degrees are in religion, VJ. I'm not sure you know that. He doesn't have any degrees in history.
Yeah, I know. It was only Oxford and National University of Singapore who
Well, it's
invited
not
him
on
to
your
the history class.
resume. Your degrees, your bachelor's, your master's, and your PhD are all in religious studies.
And my last 20 years have been teaching in two of the biggest history department in Asia and the biggest history department in the UK.
Okay, I think we
I guess
need to go ahead, Dakota.
sorry, I was just gonna say, I do feel like, yes, I think as tensions are gonna run a little higher as we get closer to this time here. You know, I think that it is important that we start getting some of these arguments, articulated down onto paper here, as opposed to just bouncing around this room where it's becoming increasingly personal. Um, and I think it would be good to continue our framework. I think it would be good to give ourselves an off ramp for this, to Aditi's concerns, to everything else. I'm not necessarily as concerned with that's a yay or nay vote, but I think we do need to establish a timeline of some sort to start getting these arguments formed rather than you know just circling around.
Go ahead, Poochie.
I just want to be a plus one to kind of Dakota's thinking in terms of at least getting a sense of, a date that we can work toward. Because ultimately, this is a recommendation that we are making to City Council. City Council will take the vote. For anybody out in the public, certainly appeal to, the people you voted in, right? Because ultimately that sits with them. That's not necessarily, I think our report and recommendation will be one factor. And that's another way, I think, for those, who have strong opinions, to work or to share their opinions with their city council members who will take the ultimate vote.
Folks, I have to run.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
All right, Aditi. I think are we ready to make a motion? Can somebody make a motion?
What's the motion, Rahina?
Well, people I think need to verbalize it, right? Like I
So-
think the original.
I want
I
to make
make-
the motion to take a vote on the for the task force to make a recommendation in the next month or roughly in that timeline. If someone wants to second me, please.
No, not just
I
second.
second it.
hold on. I think Michael, go ahead before we take a formal vote.
I
I'm
had my
sorry.
finger up. I was going to say, why couldn't we make a motion to say, try to wrap this up by, say, December? That would put a reasonable end time on this, right? We weren't going to be dragging on towards the full 18 months, but it would give us a chance to hear from Professor Lee, to hear VJ's presentation, to talk more about the specifics that VJ had mentioned before, and to give a little space for some cooling down. So I think maybe if we aimed for, say, December, it might just give us a little bit of that leeway. That'd be a good compromise position.
I'm sorry, I don't want to get harassed through my Thanksgiving in December and Diwali. I just
Neither do I.
don't, you
Neither
know,
do I.
and like,
Neither
and
do
I
I.
still want to introduce a motion to end by October,
Maybe we
if
should just
possible.
vote on this because it's been presented and seconded, and if it doesn't go through, then we will come up with a secondary plan.
Okay. Aditi, can you remake the motion and then just
I
restate?
want to reintroduce the motion for ending by the end of October roughly, as something for the task force to consider. Anyone want to second that, please?
Aditi, is there a date when we'll vote, is what you're saying, right? Vote to do the vote.
October 20th, 2025. I
Second,
introduce a motion. Thank you, Noreen.
All those in favor, raise hand. Or I'll do a roll call just to be clear. Dakota,
Yay.
Rachel,
Yay.
Noreen,
yes,
Suzanne,
Yes.
VJ,
No.
Poochie.
Yay.
Okay, and Michael has logged off. Okay. So all right, so that that passes. So we will be working on that timeline.
Thank you all.
Do we
Mhm.
realize how this looks ending it before the election, right? Is that sort of the goal? Because that feels like that just stinks of political
I
interference.
mean, BJ, to be totally honest, I don't think that I'm not sure that it even this I know that the politics is changing for sure, and this has been a big topic. I don't even know that this city council would approve it, and that's definitely not the reason for me wanting to end it. I do feel that we have done a lot, and it's like there is so much history for sure that we could be unearthing, but it is getting very personal and it is getting very intense. And I think that it's not what most of us signed up for, but at the same time, I think that we've done a lot of great work, even so, right? I really commend everyone for the time that we put in and for that energy. But it's for me, it's definitely not a political move to try to push it forward because maybe this won't change this year or next year or in 5 years. But the work that we did is still important. And whenever they reassessed it in that time, this work will still be there for everyone to look at.
And I think, though, time and again, we've expressed how flawed the process has been. Dee's talked about it. We're talking about it right now. That's the whole reason we're taking this vote. And to have then a vote come out of such a flawed process is, again, just another reason. Like, why wrap it up when we've talked about how much has been an issue when we could take the time to try to solve that? It just seems so, well, rushed through. Like we're jamming it through.
Well, we were selected in December of last year, so it's actually been 10 months, 10 months. And we were given 18. That's more than half of the 18 months.
And how many of those months have we met? How many of the times have we sat in this room together? And that has not been dealing with logistics of who's going to be at what tabling event.
Well,
Like
we have had 12 meetings total, in 13 with this one, I believe. So, and not including the ones that we will have. So that's a substantial amount of time. But also, I think, well, I'm actually not certain, but like I'm pretty sure that since we took a vote, like the discussion has formally closed. So we
fine.
should.
Just my comments. Just my comments for the record.
Okay. Oh, Michael, I just noticed that you disconnected and you're back.
My internet connection just dropped out. Are we taking
Okay.
the vote now?
We just took the vote and it passed.
To what? To end in October?
Yes. Mhm. Okay,
I think
so
that's a little.
all right, we're gonna move on in the agenda. So the next item on the agenda is to discuss upcoming special meeting dates. So we just had our regular meeting today. On September 18th, so this Thursday, I was hoping to have a hybrid listening session in the annex. So very briefly on that note, who can
Sorry.
make that listening session? Because we do need quorum for that.
What time is it?
It's going to be at, well, I think it's tentatively at 6 p.m. on Thursday. Yes, so 6 p.m. EST. So 6 to
Regina,
7
is that
p.m.
going to be over Zoom or in person?
in person. So, well, it's going to be hybrid, right? So it'll be in person with a Zoom option for people who can't make it in person.
So I have a medical comorbidity against COVID. Is it all right if I stay on the Zoom?
Yes.
Is it for all
Yes.
the whole
And
talk?
yeah, and Michael would also need the Zoom link. So yes.
Let me try to make it. I probably can do it. I'll just get to the office earlier and take it from there. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, that works. So. Sounds like Michael's
Hello?
a maybe. Yes, you're just it's a little spotty.
Rahina,
Hello?
I
I'm
just need.
gonna my poor listening skills. Which listening session were we talking about?
Uh,
What date?
Thursday at 6. So this Thursday, September 18th.
This
And Rachel, it sounds can you make it?
I
So
work
Rachel's
every
a no.
Thursday evening,
Okay.
so I can't make that one.
So Suzanne is a yes. I'm just gonna start doing a
I've got to
tab.
know because it's also Meet the Teacher for Salem Public Schools that night.
Okay. Michael's a maybe. Okay. Noreen, are you able to make it?
Yes.
Okay, Noreen's a yes. Um, Poochie.
It wasn't one of the dates I put in the doodle because I do have a conflict with 400, but if you need one more person, I'll probably be at the annex anyways, so I guess I could skip that meeting.
Okay. All right. So we might actually need that. VJ?
I may be able to. I have a tentative right now on the 18th. I can, if I can't make it there in person, I'll hop on Zoom, depending on where my other meeting ends up.
Okay. And so it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4 yeses, 2 maybes. With Eileen and Eileen, we might be able to make quorum. So I'm gonna go ahead and schedule it based on this information, and we can go from there. But yeah, just if we don't make quorum, I don't think we can proceed with it. So just FYI, so it's important that people are there. Okay. Then we have September 20th.
I'll
Oh, go
let you
ahead.
know as soon as I can confirm my schedule.
I think I heard Michael say that.
I'll try to confirm my schedule at the office today and try to make it. So if you guys need call.
Okay, perfect.
I'll try to confirm this afternoon if I can make it. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes, it was a little spotty there, but thank you. Yeah, that works perfect. Thanks, Michael. Then we have September 20th, we have a book swap tabling event at the Community Life Center from 10 to 1. I will personally be at that tabling event. Are there any people who can attend with me? It's on a Saturday, I believe. Yes,
I also work weekends. I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Yeah, I'm at the Gables. It's the season. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Can I get just one more person?
I might be able to help out in the latter half. I don't know if that would help at all.
Okay. Pucci, I will reach out to you, and I'll also reach out to Aditi, and hopefully maybe one of somebody can be there with me the whole time. Okay. Perfect. So then we have September 29th, which is the special meeting with Professor Erica Lee and VJ. Then we have on October, oh, go ahead, VJ.
Yeah, I wanted to propose, because after hearing Dr. Feener's presentation and then what he was describing about what he was going to give, I almost want to propose, for reasons I'll get into in a sec, that he presents that presentation specifically on the Salem Sumatra Aceh, the relationship, because the sources that I've put up there, which is what I want to lead a discussion in, I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of overlap there, and I'm more than happy to give an introduction at it at Dr. Erica Lee's meeting, and then we can talk more about it at the next meeting, maybe, if that's when Dr. Michael Feener wants to present on it. But just wanting to note that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also amenable to including both presentations on that agenda. It'll just be a long meeting.
Well, yeah, I mean, Suzanne had expressed reservations about such a long meeting there. And that's one of the
Yeah.
reasons why I was thinking that wrapping up in October might be too quick if we're trying to get, if we want to get that other material in there as well.
If
Other
we
than
can
that,
wrap up by the end of October, I'll sit through one more 3-hour meeting.
I should also note, I do also have an update. I have to give an update on the presentation of the history of the City Seal, having since, well, gone through and continuing to go through the documents from Eileen, as far as it relates to the changes to the seal. So that's another presentation that
Okay.
was going to need to be given.
So then, let's move forward with VJ, you presenting as planned with Professor Erica Lee, and then we'll schedule another special meeting with you and Michael to cover what you just mentioned. Does that sound good? I can look at some doodle options for October.
Sure.
okay.
I want to recommend, though, because this is going to be a discussion on the 29th around the sources, the objective sources that are up there. And Didi mentioned in an email going around that she didn't want it to be a lecture, and I'm not going to have it be a lecture, especially if we can all, study up and do the prep work. So this is an understanding of, we're all on the same page based upon the historical sources of as they relate to Salem's relationship, because these are both primary and academic sources that I think we would behoove us all to fully read through. Don't just read my quotes that I put up there. It behooves everyone to really go in and do it all and read it all, read the context, because my quotes are just a starting point, but I want you all to get a full grasp of it, and I don't want any accusations of cherry picking or anything like that.
I think that's great, VJ. Thanks for putting the work in on that.
Yeah,
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
absolutely. Okay. And then we have, that sounds great. So I'll be in touch with another doodle to try to schedule one more meeting between just in October to another special meeting. Okay, so then in October 20th we'll have our regular meeting and move forward with the report and recommendation on that date.
Is there going to be, in one of these agendas, time to discuss the makeup of the report? Because we just have the draft right now. We haven't even opened it up or talked about it. What's going to be included? How are we going to, also with the new input forms is it up and live right now? Do we have anything from that? Can we see those?
Yes, so it is up on live. We have received, I think, only 2 new entries since we changed it to jot form. So I can, oh, I don't think you're getting the automatic emails anymore. I will forward the 2 that we have received. So I'll send those over. Okay.
Thank you, Regina.
All right. I think anything else before we wrap up this agenda item? Okay. So, and then just a new business, I just have for September 29th, discussion led by VJ Joyce about the historical relationship between Salem and Sumatra. It sounds like we're also adding another special meeting to accommodate these presentations. And we'll also have a conversation about the report in one of our upcoming meetings. Okay. So anything else under new business? Does anybody have anything?
Nope.
Okay. So I think that brings us to the end of the agenda. So may I entertain a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Second.
So Rachel, seconded by Rachel, and all those in favor raise hand. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Not at all.
Right.